These women were trapped, and then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him, and then he would strangle them to death. On Sunday, February 12th, 2017, Abigail Williams was over her best friend, Liberty German's house for a sleepover. Abby and Libby were 13 and 14 respectively. That night, as they're laying in bed, they were looking out the window hoping they saw snowflakes come down because there was apparently this huge storm that was going to roll through the next day, and they were hoping that if it did, school would be canceled the next day. But when they woke up the next morning, it hadn't even snowed. However, they found out that in Delphi, Indiana, where they lived, school had been canceled preemptively in anticipation of this big storm that never really amounted to anything. So the girls got a free day off where they could actually go outside and enjoy it. So the girls start talking about how they're going to spend their extra day off, and Libby suggests, well, why don't we go check out the Monon High Bridge? It was this abandoned bridge that crossed over the stream, and a lot of their classmates would take pictures on it and post it to their social media, and the girls figured this is a great day to go do that. So Libby asks her grandmother, Becky, who was her primary caretaker, if it would be okay if they went for a hike over near this bridge. Becky gives them permission, but with the caveat that they would find their own ride there and back. So Libby convinces her older sister Kelsey to give them a ride there, and Libby speaks to her father, Derek, and he says he can pick them up, but he'd only be able to pick them up at a very specific time, which would only give the girls a couple of hours at the bridge, but they thought that was fine and that was plenty of time. So a couple hours later, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, Kelsey drops off the two girls at the start of the trail that's going to bring them to this bridge. We know the girls made it to the bridge because at 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a picture to her social media of Abby walking across the bridge. At 3:11 p.m., Libby's father, Derek, texted her and said, hey, I'm going to be there in a minute. Just want to make sure you guys are there to meet me. And she didn't text Derek back, and Derek would later say that that was pretty unusual for her. At 3:14 p.m., Derek arrives at the meeting spot, and the girls are nowhere to be found. And so Derek tries calling. There's no answer. He texts his daughter, no response. And so he ends up calling Becky, Libby's grandmother, his mother, and says, hey, did the girls contact you and change plans about where I was picking them up or when? And Becky said, no, I haven't heard from them. They said they'd be there at 3. They should be there now. I haven't heard from them. And Derek says he can't get in touch with them. So for the next 10 minutes, Becky and her husband, Mike, Libby's grandfather, just try calling over and over and over again to the girls, but nothing's going through. They can't get them to respond to text messages. So Mike leaves and meets up with Derek in the parking lot, and the two of them begin walking the trail to try to find these girls. At this point, the family's not suspecting foul play. They're thinking, the girls probably got lost, or they lost track of time, or their phones just ran out of batteries, or maybe they did get hurt and they can't move, but it's probably not that serious. They're creating scenarios in their head to rationalize what's happening. But by the time the sun went down at about 5 p.m. and there was still no sign of these girls, they ended up calling the police and officially reporting the girls missing. By 6 p.m. that night, there is this massive search combing the trail looking for these girls, but all night they're looking everywhere with hundreds of searchers and there's no sign of them. The following day, on Tuesday, February 14th, one of the searchers was about a half mile away from the bridge where the girls have been taking those pictures, and they discovered the girls' bodies right next to a creek. The police didn't release their cause of death. However, they said without a doubt this is a homicide, because apparently the scene was incredibly disturbing and had at least 2 or 3 signatures. Signatures are things done to the victims that are above and beyond what is required to end their life. Things like writing on the victims or their body position, or much, much worse. And usually you only see signatures when you're dealing with a serial killer. 3 days after the bodies were discovered, police were able to extract some video from Libby's phone. It turns out when Libby was taking those pictures of Abby on the bridge and had just posted it to social media, apparently this guy had come on the bridge and Libby must have sensed danger and she began filming him. Now, there is apparently a video that starts from the bridge and lasts all the way through the girls' final moments, but the police would release a very small snippet of this recording because it showed who they believe is the killer walking towards them with his hands in his pockets looking down, and he says to them, guys, down the hill.
Guys, down the hill. Guys, down the hill.
Despite thousands of tips pouring in as soon as this video was made public, they still don't know who this guy is, no arrests have been made, and the case remains unsolved. On April 9th, 2015, residents of the tiny farming community Fairdale, Illinois, woke up to heavy rains outside and an ominous forecast. Severe thunderstorms were going to persist all day, and then at night there was a chance of a tornado. Meteorologists were telling residents of Fairdale that if you can, you should evacuate because it's not worth sticking around for. But if you're going to ride out the storm, make sure you have a plan for how to get to a shelter if the storm gets really bad. That morning, some forecasters were saying this tornado could prove to be one of the biggest in Illinois' history. But most of the 152 Fairdale residents had lived here their whole lives, and they'd seen bad storms before, even tornadoes, and they had ridden them out before. How could this one be any different? You know, most of the time, the worst that happened was maybe a power line comes down and you lose power for the day. But unlike previous storms, this one was getting worse and worse by the minute, and by 6 p.m. that night, forecasters were no longer theorizing that this could be a huge tornado. They were outright pleading with Fairdale residents to evacuate while you still can. But despite these warnings, the vast majority of Fairdale residents stayed put. They were committed to riding the storm out. By 7 p.m., meteorologists were saying this tornado is imminent and it looks as big or bigger than the last major tornado that came through Illinois that killed 8 people and leveled an entire town. This tornado tonight is going to kill people. Just 15 minutes later at 7:15, the tornado finally touched down right outside of Fairdale. It was this massive, almost mile-wide tornado with over 200-mile-an-hour winds, and unlike other tornadoes of that size that typically move at about 30 miles an hour, this one was traveling on land at about 15 miles an hour, meaning it would be sitting over the areas it was devastating for longer amounts of time, making it even worse than some of the worst predictions that meteorologists had for this tornado. 15 minutes later at 7:30 p.m., 84-year-old Fairdale resident Clem Schultz and his wife Jerry Schultz, they were at home because they had decided to ride out the storm. As Clem is sitting in the living room watching the Weather Channel, kind of waiting for the last possible second to go into their basement, he hears his wife yell out from the kitchen to come in here and look at this. So Clem goes into the kitchen and she's pointing out the back window, and he looks out and he sees this massive tornado coming right at them. It's less than a mile away and it is way bigger than he thought it was going to be. But from their perspective, because the tornado was spinning counterclockwise, it kind of looked like it was spinning away from town into this empty field. And Clem says to his wife Jerry, you know what, it looks like it's going to miss us, but we're probably going to lose power, so I'm going to go up into the attic and get some lanterns ready. So Jerry stays in the kitchen, Clem goes up into the attic, and as he's fishing to get out the lanterns, he hears what sounds like a freight train barreling through town, and he had this little window at the edge of his attic, so he goes over and he looks out, and the tornado had not veered off into the open field. It had continued straight towards his house, and it was ripping off roofs right in front of him. And he figured, I don't have enough time to go down into the basement. I have no time to do anything. So he takes out his phone and he begins recording. Clem's house, along with all the others in that video, collapsed. And initially, Clem thought he had died because it went totally quiet and it was totally dark. And he actually said out loud, "Am I dead?" But it was the pain in his back from a crushed vertebrae that told him, no, you survived. And he begins to kind of pull himself out of the rubble, and before long, a neighbor is pulling him out. And as soon as he's out of the rubble of his house, he looks around and his whole community is pretty much gone. And as he's standing there kind of bewildered, his neighbor says, "Clem, don't look down." And Clem says, "Why?" And his neighbor says, "Because your wife is under you and she's dead." When the dust had finally settled, not only had Clem's wife been killed, but Clem's neighbor had been killed as well, because the tornado went directly through their two houses. That video that Clem shot is now used to educate people on how dangerous tornadoes really are, and how anytime a tornado is coming through your area, never go outside to film it, seek shelter. Before The Bachelorette pitted 30 men against each other to win one woman's heart, Americans watched another show about random strangers competing for a mate. It was called The Dating Game. Starting in 1965, this reality show featured a woman asking 3 men questions without seeing their faces, and based on their answers, at the end of the show, she would choose one to go on a date with. On the surface, the September 13th, 1978 showing of The Dating Game looks like every other episode, with lots of unsubtle innuendo, but this episode would go down in history as a one-of-a-kind, and not in a good way. At the end of this particular show, it was time for the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, to make her decision, and she would choose Bachelor number 1, who would turn out to be this tall, good-looking, long-haired guy whose name was Rodney. Rodney comes around the partition, and they see each other for the first time, and everybody laughs, and they hug, and the show looks like every other show, and on stage, Rodney looks like every other contestant that's ever been on the show. But after the show ended and Cheryl and Rodney went backstage and actually began having a real conversation that was not being filmed, Cheryl would say that Rodney completely changed. He became incredibly creepy and was saying things like, "I always get the girl." And then at some point he says, "Hey, you should come out with me tonight. It'll be a date you'll never forget." And she turns to him and just says, "No thanks." This would turn out to be a really wise decision because Rodney was a horrible, horrible person. Had the show done a background check on Rodney, they would have discovered that he assaulted an 8-year-old and went to jail for 3 years for it and was currently on parole. But even if they had done a background check on Rodney, the check would not have discovered what he did at night. Rodney was shamelessly cocky and self-confident, and unlike a lot of men, he had no issue walking right up to any woman anywhere and flirting with her. And he used that to his advantage. He would go up to women in bars and he would convince them that he was a fashion photographer and that they were so beautiful, would you come back to my apartment and do a photo shoot with me? And just like Cheryl on the dating show, these women were immediately kind of charmed by him and would say yes. Once they got back to his apartment, he would shut and lock the door and then become that creepy guy that Cheryl saw backstage. But unlike Cheryl, who at the time she saw this just said, "I'm not interested," and was able to leave, these women were trapped. And then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him and then he would strangle them to death. Because Rodney Alcala was not your typical dating game contestant. He was a serial killer who, by the time he stepped foot on that show and was chosen by Cheryl Bradford to win the game, he had already killed 4 people. And over a 2-year period, he killed as many as 130 people, which, if you're doing the math, is over those 2 years, he was killing at least 1 person a week. Alcala was finally apprehended and he was sentenced to death. Here are some highlights from Rodney Alcala's episode of The Dating Game.
And we're going to start by having them say hello to you and see how they sound. Number 1, would you say hello to Cheryl, please?
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Okay. And here we go.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes.
What's your best time?
The best time is at night, nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good.
Bachelor number 1. I am serving you for dinner.
Oh,
What are you called and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be Bachelor number 1, Bachelor number 2, or Bachelor number 3? Who gets the dates?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take 1.
Number 1, Bachelor number 1. All right. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations, Rod. You did it with the one answer.
I just really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya.